Sometimes the hardest part of thinking about a move isn't the money. It isn't the logistics or the uncertainty about the market or even trying to figure out where rates are headed. It's a quiet thought that lives underneath the surface. One that wonders whether making the move might later be something you wish you hadn't done. For a lot of homeowners, the possibility of regret actually feels worse than missing an opportunity. It isn't really the risk of change that stops the conversation. It's the fear of looking back one day, realizing the choice can't be undone. Sometimes the question shows up in pretty simple terms, having nothing to do with market analysis or long term planning. It's just a worry about whether you'll look back and wish you'd chosen differently. And here's the thing, that question tends to carry more weight than most people expect. Because once a home decision is on the table, it doesn't feel like a small adjustment you're making. It feels like something permanent, something that could shape the next decade of your life. And when a decision carries that kind of weight, it's completely natural for your mind to slow down and start examining every possible way it could go wrong. And if that's where you are right now, there's nothing wrong with you for thinking about it that way. Now, if you've come across the 5-step Move Decision Worksheet mentioned in this series, that's really all it is, a worksheet, a simple tool that helps people sort through the same questions we're exploring here. Some homeowners just think it through on their own. Others like having a physical place to lay their thoughts out. Either way, the purpose is the same, to give your thoughts somewhere to go so they don't keep circling around and around in your head. What's interesting is how often this fear of regret shows up even when the practical side of the move makes sense. Which is to say, the house might not fit how your lifestyle or family has evolved, or the location might not be serving your daily routines, and the numbers actually work comfortably. Yet hesitation is still there, because the mind isn't just evaluating the move anymore, it's imagining the future you, the one who might look back and question it. When people talk about risk in real estate, they usually mean financial risk. Interest rates, prices, timing, market conditions, and of course those things matter. But the kind of risk that slows people down the most isn't always financial. It's personal. It's the possibility of waking up 2 or 3 years from now and feeling like the move didn't turn out the way you thought it would. And that kind of regret tends to feel heavier than the alternative. And here's why. The memory of passing on an opportunity usually fades. Most people eventually stop thinking about the move they didn't make or the house they didn't buy. But a move you actually make stays with you. You live inside the result of it every day. That's why the mind often treats regret as something to avoid almost at any cost. It tends to elevate the fear of getting it wrong above the possibility of getting it right. And the result is a shift in perspective where the question stops being about whether the move makes sense and becomes more about whether you could live with the outcome if it turns out differently than you imagine. This is a big part of why housing decisions feel heavier than so many other choices in life. You can trade in a car, you can change jobs, but a home tends to represent more than a transaction. It holds routines, memories, family dynamics, a sense of stability. When the mind imagines leaving that behind, it often reacts as if the change is irreversible, even when, in reality, life really moves in such absolute directions. Regret is rarely just one simple fear. It's usually a handful of different uncertainties tangled together. Sometimes it helps to think of them separately. Sometimes it's the fear of losing something that feels hard to replace, a neighborhood you know well, a mortgage rate that feels unusually good right now, the familiarity of a house where every corner carries a memory. Even if the home isn't perfect anymore, those things can feel valuable simply because they're already known. Other times, the fear is really about expectations. People worry that the new place might not feel the way they imagine it will, that the lifestyle shift won't quite live up to what they hope for, or that the new house will solve certain problems but introduce others they can't anticipate. And that possibility alone can make the mind very cautious. Then there's a layer that often goes unspoken, The worry that if the decision turns out poorly, there's no one else to blame. Housing decisions tend to feel personal in that way. If you stay, it was your choice. If you move, it was your choice. And that responsibility can make the mind search for absolute certainty before acting. The difficulty, of course, is that housing decisions almost never offer certainty. They offer information, probabilities, and personal preferences, but rarely certainty. And when the mind treats a decision like this as something that must be guaranteed before it's taken, the process can stall for a very long time. Part of what amplifies regret in housing decisions is a sense that the choice is permanent. When people picture moving, they often imagine it as a one-way, one-time threshold, and that passing through it has a single fixed outcome. And that image alone can make the stakes feel enormous. But life rarely unfolds that way. Homes get bought and sold, neighborhoods evolve, families change their needs, people relocate for work or health or opportunity. When you step back and look at a longer stretch of time, housing decisions are often chapters rather than permanent endpoints. Yet in the moment of deciding, the mind doesn't usually see the chapters. It sees consequences. It imagines this one decision stretching forward indefinitely. And because of that, the brain tends to magnify the fear of regret far beyond the actual probability of living with a mistake forever. What this does in practical terms is create a strange kind of pressure where every variable feels like it has to be solved before the move happens. The perfect timing, the perfect home, the perfect sense of confidence. And when those conditions don't appear, maintaining the status quo can feel like the safest response. Because if nothing changes, nothing can go wrong. Another reason regret looms so large here is that most homeowners have lived through at least one housing decision already. You might remember a house you bought years ago and wonder whether you should have chosen differently. Maybe there was a property you passed on that later appreciated faster than anyone expected. Perhaps there was a move that in hindsight felt rushed or mistimed. Those memories stick with you because housing decisions unfold over long periods of time and you live inside the outcome. So when a new decision appears, the mind naturally reaches back and asks whether it learned the right lessons from the last decision. Sometimes those memories create useful perspective. They remind you to slow down, gather information, and think carefully about what you actually want from the next chapter. Other times, they create pressure. The belief that this time the decision must be perfect because there may not be another chance to correct it. And that expectation can make decision making more difficult than it needs to be because perfection isn't actually a standard most housing decisions can live up to. Most people, when they eventually look back at the moves they've made, don't evaluate them as strictly perfect or flawed decisions. They see them as transitions that made sense at the time given what life looked like then. Given all that, the question becomes, how do you think clearly about a move when the fear of regret is hanging over your shoulder? For a lot of homeowners, the first step isn't eliminating that fear. It's recognizing that the fear itself is actually part of the decision process. Your mind is trying to protect the future you. It's asking careful questions because it understands the decision matters. Sometimes the conversation shifts when the fear stops being treated like an obstacle and starts being treated more like information. Instead of trying to remove the possibility of regret entirely, which is rarely possible, the focus can move toward understanding what matters most in the present version of your life, how the home supports or strains the day-to-day rhythms you're actually living right now, whether the current situation still fits, or whether you're holding on to it primarily because it feels safe. Understanding that difference tends to reduce pressure, not because it produces an immediate answer, it doesn't always, but because it helps the thought process become more grounded in everyday life rather than hypothetical futures. And that matters because the purpose of thinking through a housing decision isn't to guarantee a perfect outcome, it's to understand the trade-offs clearly enough that whichever direction you eventually choose feels intentional rather than incidental. For many people, the conversation about moving doesn't resolve quickly. It sits quietly in the background for a while. Some days, the idea of staying feels right. Other days, the idea of moving starts to make more sense. That back and forth is actually more common than most homeowners realize. And the presence of regret doesn't necessarily mean the decision is leaning one way or the other. Often, it simply means the choice matters enough that your mind wants to treat it carefully, which frankly is a reasonable response to something this significant. Find yourself in that place. It's okay for the process to take time. The goal isn't to rush towards certainty. Sometimes the goal is simply to understand the decision a little better each time you return to it. That's also where something like the 5-step Move Decision Worksheet can be genuinely useful for some people. Not because it hands you an answer, but because it creates a place to sort through the different pieces without the conversation becoming overwhelming. And as this question continues to unfold, another question often begins to surface. And it has less to do with regret and more to do with the energy it takes to keep thinking about the decision at all. Because for a lot of homeowners, after a while, the challenge isn't just the fear of getting it wrong, it's the fatigue from carrying the question for so long.